Hey everybody, welcome to Gobbo's Underhive Workshop. Today we're going to be talking about two very quick tutorials on making terrain that can just add to some of your scatter, or it can give you some stuff to use in the future on other projects. So to go over what we're going to use today, we're going to use a hobby knife, a snap blade, a pair of wire cutters, or needle nose pliers. I'm using needle nose pliers. Then I got these cubes that I picked up in the bargain bin, the impulse buy craft area of Michael's. But you can also order these online, or you can find them in Lowe's in the painting section. They're just little, I don't even know, probably 3/4 by 3/4 inch wood cubes, craft wood cubes. Let's check them. Yep, just about 3/4 of an inch. They are pretty good scale-wise for miniatures. Let's see if I got something here I can show some scale with. But here's next to a little Blood Bowl goblin. So can make pretty good little things. Actually ended up making a bunch, or started making a bunch of these for a Shadowrun game at one point. So next we're going to need some popsicle sticks. Then good old sticks that you find in the backyard, and some of that cast off I talked about saving last time. That's going to be the bases for these. So to talk about stick collection, I usually go for very, very dry woods, stuff that's already had a chance to dry out in the sun. Then I'm going to go ahead and soak it really quick and let it dry out again, just to kind of make sure that any little critters that may have still been living inside of it decided to move on, pack up, and move out. At that point, I'll usually let them sit for a bit, baking essentially in the sun, either in like a glass jar or a plastic jar, something like that, so they can just keep getting hot. Encourage any other little critters to get on going, and also to dry the wood out. You don't necessarily want to put a couple of pieces of wood down and then, a couple days later find out that there was like a millipede or something living inside of it. The other thing you can do is you can pop these into the oven at a very low temperature, the lowest temperature you can do in the oven, just to kind of give them that one little last go around. But I've honestly found that leaving them in the sun, letting them dry out naturally for a long time works pretty well. These I collected probably 5 years ago. Just something that I do when I find sticks that look about the right size, that have some sort of storytelling capability. I'm going to go ahead and collect them. So this is a free material. This is something you can just find. A lot of people use bark and stuff for like terrain and rocks and all of that. So it's all kind of the same idea. What you can use that's naturally occurring that you have access to can help you out quite a bit. In modern tournament play, in games like Warhammer 40k and other battle games, there's a big emphasis on making sure that the board is balanced. You essentially want to make sure that whatever you make on one side of the board has a balancing side on the other side of the board. Because of that, there's a lot of different information out there. There's a lot of different guides out there that talk about 2-story and 3-story L shapes, woods that block line of sight, how big they need to be. You got to be about 9 inches long, you got to be about 3.5 inches wide, all that sort of stuff. We'll go over that. I'll go over that when we get into building buildings, when we get into building some manufactorum pieces and stuff like that. But for a lot of this smaller scatter, you're going a little bit more, in my opinion, for the storytelling, the narrative side of it, or stuff that you can use on a D&D board. And you're also looking to kind of make sure that none of the waste, in air quotes, from past projects is going to waste. Or if you find something cool and quick like this, you can actually just jump into it. So with that in mind, we're not really looking at developing balanced scatter. We're looking at just making scatter in general. And scatter in general definitely has a place even on the tournament board. If you're looking at having kind of the versatility of something that you can use in a tournament board, or something that you can use on a narrative board, you want to basically make sure that you make two roughly the same size. So talking about that rough size, we're going to try to go for something about this size. I can use a piece like this as scatter in a tabletop role-playing game like Savage Worlds, something to make a little bit more of an immersive experience for the players. Or if I have a pre-cut and pre-made base that's about the size to block line of sight on a tournament board, I can drop a couple of these onto that piece to say, okay, here's the base that's blocking line of sight. Now here's some stuff on top of that that acts to be the immersion. And then if it's like something that's going to be passable no matter what, it's going to block line of sight when you're in it. You don't necessarily have to worry about whether or not your guys can fit in it. you move into that area, you can just pick the pieces up and it's understood, okay, I've got a unit who's obscured by this terrain, and as soon as they move through, you put it back. So there's definitely a bunch of different reasons, and that's kind of why I try to make these little chunks. More of my goal is always kind of immersion and just making the board look a little bit more realistic, and I also focus very, very heavily on narrative play. So keep that in mind as I'm going through this. But I do sort of design, or I do sort of come up with these ideas because I want to make sure that it has the versatility to continue playing on a tournament board. If you've been following along with our podcast, you know that we've talked about the Eldari and the Exodites already, and we are planning on covering more of the Space Elves as we move forward. With that in mind, when I develop terrain for use in scenarios that are a little bit more natural, a little bit more elf, whether or not that's Space Elf or non-Space Elf, I have a tendency to kind of gravitate towards doing these sort of naturalistic builds. So with that in mind, we're going to look at making a couple of these log stacks, just either fallen debris that is out on the battlefield or in the forest, or maybe stuff that has been purposefully stacked up, piled up to be used as a natural defense. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the sticks that I've got and the scrap that I've got and make a decision about what I want to do. So I like these. They're pretty good size. They're pretty good log size. Get an idea of it next to a Chaos Guardsman. This one's a little long, so I'm going to want to break it. Those are about the right size for this piece, I think. And now I'm going to tell a little bit of story with the shape. So I'm going to knock this entire edge off. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to notch that. Actually going to kind of go long. You know what? We are going to use this piece as a little bit long. We've got this irregular shape, so we might as well let the irregular shape do some work for us. So we'll kind of come around like that. Okay, and then this piece will sit next to it. Maybe that will sit like that. And then maybe we'll take a couple of these smaller pieces and do something with them so it looks a little bit more random. Yeah, I like that. All right, so now that I've got kind of a basic shape down, I'm going to go ahead and bevel the edges. So for this, I'm going to use something like the snap blade because I've got a lot more length, and then I'm just going to kind of cut into and shave down to that using that sharp blade edge to get a nice beveled edge on this poster board style material. So you'll notice as I was working, sometimes I was cutting towards myself, other times I was cutting away from myself, sometimes I was putting it down on the surface and cutting and all of that. If you watch cooking shows and stuff like that, you'll see chefs cut in a variety of different ways. Same principle here. Sometimes I'm going to cut away from myself, sometimes I'm going to cut towards myself, sometimes I'm going to cut down towards the mat. It's just going to depend on how much control I'm trying to use in the process and how much control I currently have over the blade. But be very mindful, be very careful when you are cutting towards yourself. You want to have a lot of control over what you're doing. You want to know how much pressure you're putting in. You want to make sure that you know how fast that knife's going to pass through everything, because you can hurt yourself. Enough safety for today. All right, so we've got two different bases, like I said. Try to balance it out. You probably saw me sort of mock up what I was going to do with this one. Now here is where generally I make a decision. Am I going to base it now, or am I going to put everything on it and then base it afterward? And there's kind of reasons for doing each. In this particular case, I'm going to put these on now and I'm going to base around them, and that's because I want these to look like they have been in the area for a while, and that the sand, or not the sand, but the material that's around them has built up around them rather than they're laying on top of the material. With that in mind, I'm going to assemble both of these guys, and I'll be back to talk about basing. So for the second piece, I went with a little bit more of a deliberate stacking, is where this one could be deadfall or something that had just sort of been pushed up and out of the way, or maybe moved for another reason. On this one, I actually went for a little bit more of a deliberate setup, where maybe they had at some point somebody had tried to build either a windbreak or shelter or something to hide behind, and it had fallen apart over the time. One of the things that's important to sort of maintain is areas that the miniatures can still stand in. One of the things that I've seen in the past, a lot of times with heavier terrain or denser terrain in city scenarios or city fight scenarios, is you can't necessarily get all of your units onto it because you've got a lot of uneven, non-flat surfaces. In these cases, there is areas for units to hide behind. This could be dense cover or light cover. Also, this is about the size, with these two pieces together, of one of those light cover cases you might see in a tournament setup. The other thing is they're balanced. So if you aren't using them to tell a story on a role-playing game table, or using them to tell a story in a narrative campaign, you can have one on one side of the battlefield and another on the other side of the battlefield. So These are pretty quick. All right. So basing is one of the cases where I do not use hot glue. And I also use a variety of materials. So one of my favorite materials, the material we're going to talk about first here, is crushed coral. The reason I like crushed coral is because you can get it in really big bags. I got a 5-pound bag probably 10 years ago, and I still use it to this day. On top, I've got this coarser, grittier stuff, and then underneath I've got essentially super fine sand, and I have the super fine sand because the longer the crushed coral has sat on itself or been moved around, the more it's pulverized. So crushed coral can kind of give you a couple of different varieties, a couple of different grits all in one. I like to put them into containers like this because then I can use either my hands to sprinkle the material over or something like a plastic spoon to spread it out. The other thing I'm going to use in this particular case is pulverized little chunks of polymer clay. I do a lot of rolling out textures and stuff like that in polymer clay, and I get these little extra pieces, chop them up super fine. It gives me this bigger grit stuff that I can use, and that's what we're going to put down first. We're going to put the crushed coral on top of it. It's going to give us kind of a 2-layer experience. And sometimes I'll use sand or maybe harder, coarser gravel, but what I'm really kind of trying to go for is something that looks a little bit like this. So just a couple of different grits rather than a bunch of different grits. So we're going to move over to just normal PVA glue. Going to dab it on, and then once it's on, I'm going to use an old dry brush, and I'm going to spread it all over. So now that I've got the bigger pieces on and it's all coated with glue, I'm going to go ahead and get them entirely covered with this crushed coral. And the way I'm going to do this is just dip the entire thing into the crushed coral. I got a couple of places where it's really thin. You can kind of see the material coming through, but it's still textured. And then I've got a bunch of bigger chunks. Depending on how I dry brush those or brush those could end up looking like leaves and some other stuff like that. And of course, once we go into the painting step, I can also add some stuff. I also put a little piece of this cast off down underneath to give a little bit more of a height to it. So I actually do have a little bit of a gap in there. And what I could do at this point is I could put a little bit more PVA glue into that gap and layer this stuff again a second time. And just kind of get it all in there. That looks pretty good. And then in this case, instead of submerging the piece, I'm going to sprinkle it intentionally where I want it. And I'm going to leave it on there for a little bit. I'll just put this guy to the side for now. Alright, and for the second piece, same thing. I'm just going to go ahead and push it in, submerge it in entirely. Sprinkling on the places that I miss by pushing it down. Give it a couple of seconds, pull it out, tap it off. Looks pretty good. I don't think I'm going to do any additions to this one. I'm just going to set it aside. This one's had a couple minutes to dry, a couple seconds to dry. Oh, I got that thicker buildup down there kind of underneath. Okay. So that's it for these two guys, two pieces of scatter that can be painted up and used somewhere else. Alright, so these two pieces are done, so I'm going to set them aside and let them dry so I can get ready to paint them in an upcoming piece, an upcoming tutorial. Next up, crates. I like making these independently for a couple of different reasons. One, you can put them to the side and pull them into a bigger build later if you want to put some crates on something in a larger terrain piece, or if you're building a larger terrain piece and you just need a couple of details to make it pop. But the other reason I like to make them separate is I run a lot of tabletop role-playing stuff. I use the Savage World system. Savage World system is pretty miniature intensive when it comes to combat, and it uses 1 inch by 1 inch square. So in a particular scenario that I was running, I had a team moving in on some goons that were protecting some crates, protecting a warehouse, and the idea was that the team moving in needed to eliminate the goons to save the MacGuffin. The MacGuffin in this particular case was an amulet. So I built these really quickly just for use in that scenario. I dropped them on the board in kind of a random pattern, and I had the goons that were protecting the MacGuffin on one place, and then my players entered from another side and, you know, got a little bit of an interactive, immersive experience sneaking up on the goons that they were trying to take out. So that's the reason that I build detail stuff like this kind of separate. It's one of the other reasons that I like to grab little things like these 3D printed oil crates that I've got, because again, it's just stuff that you can use to spice up a role-playing game board. But at the end of the day, you can also use these and combine them onto a base to use in a traditional tabletop skirmish or wargame. So I'm going to go through how I build these. I'm going to use these cubes that I found. I'm just going to spice them up a little bit so they're a little bit more interesting. So while my prototypes only have their corners done, for these we're going to do all of the different sides. And the way that we're going to get that edge detail is we're going to use popsicle sticks. Popsicle sticks are another thing you can usually pick up at a craft store like Michael's, or you can pick up in the craft section at Lowe's or something like that. I do something very specific when I use this material. I'm going to chop off the top and the bottoms, the curved part of the popsicle stick, and I'm going to use wire cutters to do that. And the reason that I chop those off is that they actually make pretty good shingles when you are doing fantasy builds. So you get these like little tiny shingles. So I actually have a Ziploc bag of all of the little ends cut off so I can keep them in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and cut a couple of these guys down. Again, I'm not really worried about whether or not this leaves a ragged edge or leaves a ragged cut or isn't 100% perfectly straight, because kind of the charm of doing this, especially using these cut off pieces later as shingles for a fantasy build, you get that unevenness. There we go. We got a couple of sticks good to go. So we are going to cut them down. I'm just going to make sure that there's no burrs or edges. Bonus tool, sanding sticks. These are basically the same types of things that you would use to file your nails. You can pick up online pretty cheap. You can get a huge bag of them. They last for a very long time, but they're super, super useful in any of this sort of like kit bashing or terrain building stuff. It's actually a tool tip I picked up from Adam Savage back when he did a talk probably back in the Mythbusters days, but I know it's something that he's also covered in his show Tested, where he goes over kind of his favorite tools. It's become a staple in my toolkit probably for the last 10 years in any sort of fabrication or kit bashing I do. But I'm going to go ahead and make sure that any burrs or extra kind of leftover wood splinters or anything like that is gone. You can actually also use this directly on Gator board, which is pretty nice. Gator board is something that you can sand. So if you've got an edge and you want to kind of get rid of it, there I am, rounding it just with the sanding stick itself. It might be easier to see against there, but I rounded that tip. Just can round it out pretty good. They're good actually for using on plastic as well. If you've got something that you're kit bashing or something that you're trying to prepare, I'm trying to prepare some of these extra Tyranid bits for use in a build I'm doing, Gene Stealer build I'm doing, so I can sand down these ragged cuts that I made with a wire cutter and just kind of get them prepped. Nice flat surface that I can glue to another surface pretty easily. So very, very useful things, but I'm going to go ahead and use it to just clean up any of these edges, make sure I knock off any of that extra wood that's going to either splinter or fall off. Looks like that's probably the only other place that I really have to worry about it. And again, just check it with my finger, make sure I don't have any spots of roughness that are going to catch or snag. I'm going to keep these because they're going to be very useful for the rest of this build. So here is what I want to do. I want to basically create corners and then a top and a bottom. So I'm going to use my material as my measuring stick. Again, I could use the actual ruler to measure this, but for our purpose, this is actually just fine. So that's about what I want. And then I'm going to want to actually split it in half. I'm going to want to make a bunch of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably get several pieces out of this. So I'm just going to split a couple of these in half. Alright, now that I've got all of these little pieces cut out, I'm going to go ahead and lay a bunch of them out next to each other, just so I know where I'm going to make my cuts. I'm going to mark all of these up, and then I'm going to cut them down to size. Alright, now that I've got all my little tiny pieces cut and ready to go, I'm just going to start attaching them with hot glue to the sides of these cubes. In this case, I'm trying to go for just adding a little bit of edge detail to each side. Just giving it a little bit more. It doesn't look like a cube. You know, I bought these cubes for probably $1.50 after the tax because it was in one of those little bins. So all I'm doing is I'm just kind of butting it up, and I'm gonna butt it up a little bit off center like that, and then I'm just gonna keep it going. So this side is the long side, so this side is going to be the long side. But again, that's just to give a little bit of visual interest. So this will be the long side, and then this will be the overlap side. To me, for whatever reason, it makes it feel like these were like handmade. You know, these are the type of crates that some poor servitor is stapling together in the background. All right, I'm going to go ahead and apply the rest of these, and then I'll talk about sanding it down. Okay, so now that I've got my little crate all done, I'm going to give the top of it a little mani-pedi here. I'm going to take the sanding stick and just make sure that I knock anything down. Cool, pretty good to go there. These aren't quite long enough. I want them to actually bridge all the way, so I'm going to go ahead and prepare a couple more of these guys, and then we'll talk about doing the top. All right, now for the tops, we're not going to do bottoms. We're going to leave the bottoms the way they are. I went ahead and sanded the top and the bottom just so they sit nice and flush. There's no little spurs sticking up, but for the tops, we're just going to put a couple of pieces bridge in the corners, and I'm going to go over and do the same thing. Cut the top and the bottom off. I'm going to split a couple of these guys, and then I'm going to go ahead and make the top of these crates. Here we go. So in this case, as I'm measuring them, I'm only measuring the tops that I need, which should be 8, because I'm going to need 1 for the front, 1 for the back, and then I'm going to have to cut other lengths for the sides. So right now, I'm just going to do those front and backs. Well, that should be good. And I'm just going in and using little pieces of scrap to fill in all these little gaps. Again, just sort of measuring the distance I need with the material that I already have. Sanding down any irregularities or trimming off any irregularities, and then gluing everything together. two different styles of crates. We've got the ones with the tops and we've got the ones with the sides. Obviously, if you don't want the tops on, you just stop once you get to the midway point there of attaching the sides. I like to keep mine separate from a full build because they can be used just like this as independent pieces of scatter on a wargame tabletop or pulled over into a role-playing game scenario. But you could take these as kind of pre-made pieces and then glue them onto existing terrain pieces or build them up. I could have laid out a piece like this where I'm looking for some corner terrain or maybe some impassable terrain. I could glue a couple of them up like that and then maybe put them on top of each other, create a little bit of a corner for some units to hide behind if I wanted to. 100% up to you. I like to keep mine separate on the side so I can mix them in when I need them, or I can just have them ready at hand to be used in a role-playing game scenario. Well, there's two simple tutorials I hope you guys find useful. Those crates were made with things bought from the impulse aisle at a craft store. So Michael's, any of the different craft stores you can get to, usually you can find little things like this in the impulse buy area. If not, you can always order them online. I'll try to put a link down below to a place to order these little cubes. Popsicle sticks, another thing that you can get at most craft stores or on Amazon in bulk. Really, really useful. And then these piles of sticks, these piles of logs, just sticks that I collected in my own backyard. So making terrain is really about using what you have access to easy at hand and things that aren't necessarily super expensive. A lot of this hobby to me is about figuring out how to make the things that will suit your tabletop needs, whether that's a battlefield or a role-playing game with either reused or easy to find materials. And it's very nice to buy the official 3D printed or the official injection molded sets. They do pop, they do have a lot of detail and all of that, but I think a lot more of it is about mixing these kind of older do-it-yourself terrain building ideals into some of the new stuff that exists. And this stuff is super useful. I mean, these crates and these log piles are things that I could use in a role-playing game or on a tabletop. I'll cover painting all of this in a future tutorial. If you like the content that you're seeing, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you can get notifications when we drop new stuff. I am Goblin King here at the Underhive Workshop. If you are interested in the lore and creative writing in the Warhammer 40k universe, please check out our podcast, Under the Hive of Madness. If you're interested in helping see our content grow, you can do that by heading over to www.patreon.com/underthehiveofmadness. There you'll find a couple of different tiers which give you access to some extra content. At our lowest tier, a $3 tier, you can get access to video versions of our podcasts with a little bit extra Patreon-only material there at the beginning. You also get access at the lowest level to our quarterly painting contest, the Red Squig painting contest, which you guys have seen the videos here for on YouTube. At higher levels, you can help us kind of figure out what new content we're going to make, which direction we might take our lore or creative writing episodes, and at even higher levels, you can get access to some art assets and stuff that we've developed for you guys. If you want to get custom objective modifiers, custom objective markers or anything else that you might want. If you have any questions, comments, or you would like to suggest a future tutorial that we run, please hit us up in the comments or email us at underthehiveofmadness@gmail.com. You can also join our growing Discord community. All of the links to everything I've mentioned are down there in the notes. Looking forward to seeing you guys next time.